The blizzard had been raging for 11 days straight, and Magnus Olafsson stumbled through waist-deep snow toward the only structure still showing smoke from its chimneys. Inside what the other trappers had mockingly called Halvorsson's war bunker, Lars sat comfortably by a single fire, using a fraction of the wood that had already killed 3 men in their frozen cabins just 2 miles away. Before we go further, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier survival innovation move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. Magnus Olafsson had not slept in 48 hours. His cabin, built the previous spring using methods his father had taught him in Norway, was failing. The roof sagged under 8 feet of snow. Ice formed on the interior walls, despite a fire that consumed wood faster than he could feed it. The temperature inside hovered near freezing, even as he burned through his carefully rationed firewood supply at a catastrophic rate. Outside, the wind screamed across the Montana Territory with a fury he had never experienced in 7 winters on the frontier. The thermometer, nailed to his cabin wall visible by firelight, read 18 degrees below zero. That was inside. Outside, Magnus knew the temperature had dropped past 40 below, the kind of cold that killed exposed skin in minutes. The kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals before it left your lungs. The kind of cold that made experienced trappers die in their sleep, despite being inside their own shelters. Magnus made his decision shortly after dawn on the 11th day of the blizzard. His firewood supply, meant to last until March, would be gone in 3 more days at his current consumption rate. The roof was making sounds that suggested imminent collapse. He had heard nothing from his neighbors in over a week. He needed help, and there was only one place within walking distance that might offer. Lars Halvorsson's bunker. The structure sat 1.5 miles northeast of Magnus's failing cabin. Magnus had watched Lars build it the previous summer. He had joined the other trappers in mocking the construction. He had called it a waste of time and effort. He had made jokes about Lars preparing for war instead of winter. Now, stumbling through snow that reached his waist, Magnus understood that Lars had been preparing for exactly this. The wind tried to push him off course. The snow was so deep and the visibility so poor that Magnus navigated by memory and instinct. He knew this country well enough to find Lars's location even in whiteout conditions, but the effort required every bit of his remaining strength. His hands were numb inside thick mittens. His face, wrapped in wool and fur, burned with cold, despite the layers. Each breath hurt. When he finally saw the smoke, Magnus almost wept with relief. 2 thin columns rising from metal chimneys barely visible above the snow-covered earth. The bunker itself was nearly invisible, buried under accumulated snow that made it indistinguishable from the hillside it had been built into. Only the dark rectangle of the door, swept clear of snow, and those 2 steady streams of smoke indicated human habitation. Magnus reached the door and pounded on it with frozen fists. The door, heavy and solid, didn't even vibrate under his blows. He pounded again, harder, and shouted Lars's name into the wind. Spring arrived late in 1883. Snow lingered in the high country well into May, and the tributaries of the Yellowstone ran high with meltwater. Lars Halvorsson and Anders Eriksson had established their trapping camp in a valley they had worked for 3 seasons. The location was reliable for beaver, far enough from established trails to avoid competition, and sheltered enough to provide decent hunting through the lean months. They had built a standard cabin the first year. Notched logs, mud chinking, pole roof covered with bark and sod. It took them 5 days. The structure kept out most of the wind and rain. It was adequate for their needs, or so they believed. Neither man questioned the construction. It was how trappers built cabins. It was how their fathers had built cabins. It worked well enough. The partnership functioned smoothly. Anders handled the trapline on the western creeks. Lars worked the eastern drainage. They met at the cabin each evening to process pelts, cook meals, and maintain their equipment. The arrangement was efficient and profitable. By late April, they had accumulated nearly 200 prime beaver pelts worth substantial money in St. Louis. On May 2nd, a late-season storm moved through the territory. The weather had been mild for 2 weeks, and both men had grown accustomed to spring conditions. The storm came from the northwest without warning. Temperature dropped 30 degrees in 3 hours. Rain turned to heavy, wet snow. Wind increased to speeds that bent trees and tore branches loose. Anders was checking the western trapline when the storm hit. Lars was at the cabin preparing lunch. He heard the wind change and watched the sky darken. Within minutes, visibility dropped to nothing. Snow fell so heavily that Lars could barely see the creek 30 yards from the cabin door. He waited for Anders to return, certain his partner would recognize the danger and head back immediately. Hours passed. The storm intensified. By late afternoon, Lars knew something was wrong. Anders should have returned. Even in poor visibility, the trapline was only 3 miles from camp. Anders knew the country well enough to navigate in difficult conditions, but the storm was beyond difficult. It was catastrophic. Lars put on every layer of clothing he owned and went looking for his partner. The wind nearly knocked him down the moment he left the cabin. Snow had already accumulated 2 feet deep. Drifts were forming against every obstacle. Lars followed the creek west, knowing Anders would use it for navigation. He found Anders 2 miles from camp, lying face down in snow that had drifted 4 feet deep against a fallen log. The temporary lean-to shelter Anders had tried to construct had collapsed under snow weight. Anders had frozen to death trying to wait out the storm. Lars carried his partner's body back to camp through snow that made every step a battle. The storm continued for 2 more days. Lars buried Anders on a south-facing hillside above the valley. The ground was partially frozen, and digging the grave took most of a day. He marked it with stones arranged in a cairn that would survive seasons of weather. He spoke no words over the grave. Anders had not been a religious man, and Lars respected that. The marker and the location were enough. He returned to the cabin and sat staring at walls that suddenly seemed inadequate. The structure had sheltered him comfortably for 3 years. It had seemed solid and well built. Now it looked fragile. The gaps between logs where chinked mud had fallen away, the roof that sagged slightly under even moderate snow load, the door that hung crooked on leather hinges, the single small window covered with oiled paper that tore in strong wind. Anders had died because a temporary shelter collapsed. But Lars understood that their permanent cabin was only marginally better. If the storm had caught Lars away from camp, if he had been forced to shelter in the cabin during the worst of the blizzard, would it have protected him? The honest answer was maybe. The cabin might have held, it might have failed. The difference between survival and death should not depend on maybe. Lars spent the next week completing the season's work alone. He checked the remaining traps, processed the final pelts, and packed everything for the journey to St. Louis. The work was mechanical. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the storm, analyzing what had killed Anders, considering what could have prevented it. He visited other camps in the area before leaving for St. Louis. Most trappers had already departed, heading to trading posts or settlements to sell their furs and resupply. But a few remained, and Lars talked to them about winter shelter. He asked questions about cabin construction, about storms they had survived, about close calls they had experienced. A pattern emerged from these conversations. Every experienced trapper had stories about cabins failing, roofs collapsing under snow, doors torn off by wind, walls breached by desperate animals, fires that consumed structures when heating became critical. The failures were common enough that men accepted them as inevitable risks of frontier life. Lars rejected that acceptance. Anders's death had not been inevitable. It had been the result of inadequate shelter. If better shelter existed, Anders would still be alive. The question was not whether better shelter was possible. The question was how to build it. He left the Kia Mountains in early June with his pack train loaded with furs. The journey to St. Louis normally took 3 weeks. Lars used the time to think about construction, about materials, about what made structures strong or weak. He had no formal education in building or engineering, but he had watched structures his entire life, and he began to see them differently now. The route to St. Louis took Lars through scattered settlements and past abandoned camps. He began stopping at every structure he encountered, empty cabins left behind by trappers who had moved on or died, trading post buildings, remote homesteads. He examined each one with new attention to detail, looking specifically for signs of failure. Most frontier cabins showed similar weaknesses. The corners, where notched logs created natural stress points, often showed damage. Logs had shifted or rotted where water collected in the notch joints. On abandoned cabins, Lars could see where animals had exploited these corners, tearing at the weakened joints to gain entry. The notching technique was fast and traditional, but it created structural vulnerabilities that time and weather made worse. The chinking between logs was another consistent failure point. Mud mixed with moss or grass, the standard approach, dried and cracked with seasonal temperature changes. Once cracks formed, water entered. Water froze and expanded, making cracks larger. Wind penetrated through gaps, carrying heat away from interiors. On many abandoned cabins, entire sections of chinking had fallen out, leaving gaps wide enough to pass a hand through. Roofs showed the most dramatic failures. Simple pole and bark construction, adequate for moderate conditions, collapsed under heavy snow loads. Lars found several cabins with roofs completely caved in, logs and bark scattered across interior floors. The failures followed a pattern: poles spaced too far apart, inadequate support structure, and roofing materials that absorbed water and added weight, without adding strength. Doors and windows, when they existed, were obvious weak points. Leather hinges rotted. Wooden hinges broke under stress. Simple bar locks could be forced or bypassed. Oiled paper windows tore in wind. Even rawhide coverings, stronger than paper, deteriorated with exposure to moisture and temperature extremes. Every cabin Lars examined had door or window damage if it had been abandoned for more than one season. He talked to people when he found them: settlers heading west, trappers heading east with their season's catch, traders moving goods between frontier outposts. He asked them about their shelters, about winters they had survived, about storms that had tested their buildings. The stories accumulated. A trapper who survived 3 days in a collapsed cabin, sheltering under fallen roof poles while a blizzard raged. A family that lost their cabin to fire when desperate heating during extreme cold ignited creosote buildup in a poorly built chimney. A man who froze to death 10 feet from his cabin door because wind had torn the door off and he lacked the strength to reach shelter. Lars began to understand that frontier construction prioritized speed over quality because most men did not stay in one place long. Trappers moved frequently, following animal populations. Settlers often failed and moved on. Building a cabin that would last decades seemed wasteful when the builder might only use it for 1 or 2 seasons. But Lars was not planning to move frequently. He intended to work the same territory for years. His shelter needed to last and needed to protect him reliably through conditions that could kill. Speed of construction was irrelevant if the structure failed during crisis. Lars reached St. Louis in late June 1883. The city had grown substantially since his last visit 2 years earlier. New buildings lined streets that had been muddy tracks. Warehouses clustered near the riverfront where steamboats loaded and unloaded goods destined for frontier settlements. The construction activity was constant. Crews worked on multiple projects simultaneously, and Lars watched them with intense focus. He sold his furs to a trading company for a fair price. The transaction took less than an hour. Most trappers would have spent the next few days in saloons, enjoying civilized comforts before returning to wilderness isolation. Lars spent his time studying buildings. He started at the riverfront warehouses. These structures needed to support heavy loads and withstand harsh conditions. Lars observed how builders reinforced corners using techniques beyond simple notching. They used mortise and tenon joints, connecting timbers with precisely cut interlocking pieces. They used metal brackets and bolts where extra strength was required. The methods were slower than frontier construction, but the resulting structures were substantially stronger. He watched masons building a new bank. The brick pattern fascinated him. Each brick overlapped the joints below it, creating a structure where no single weak point existed. The pattern distributed weight and stress across the entire wall. If one brick failed, the surrounding bricks maintained structural integrity. Lars recognized the principle could apply to other materials and construction methods. Near the city's edge, he found military fortifications left from earlier conflicts. Earthworks and sandbag barriers had been constructed during the Civil War decades earlier. Most had deteriorated, but some remained intact. Lars examined them carefully. The sandbags, filled with soil and stacked in running bond patterns similar to brickwork, created walls that were thick, dense, and incredibly stable. The bags had settled over time, compressing into solid barriers that would resist significant force. The concept intrigued him. Sandbags were portable when empty, easy to fill with locally available material, and could be stacked by one person working alone. The filled bags created thermal mass similar to stone or adobe, but required no specialized masonry skills. A structure built with earth-filled bags would be fireproof, weatherproof, and capable of supporting substantial weight. Lars spent 2 full days at a lumber yard watching carpenters work. He paid particular attention to door construction. Quality doors used tongue and groove joinery, creating single-piece assemblies from multiple planks. They reinforced them with diagonal bracing and mounted them on heavy iron hinges that were mortised into both door and frame. The hardware was expensive, but it transformed doors from weak points into structural elements as strong as the walls they occupied. He purchased supplies with his fur money. Burlap sacks, 200 of them, folded and bundled, heavy iron hinges rated for doors weighing over 100 pounds, metal brackets and rivets, dark wood stain with weatherproofing properties, square-cut nails in quantities that made the merchant assume Lars was building multiple structures. The purchases were expensive and heavy, but Lars knew exactly how he would use every item. He left St. Louis in mid-July, leading 2 pack horses loaded with supplies that would have seemed bizarre to any other trapper. Lars returned to the Montana Territory in early August. The high country was at peak summer condition. Temperatures were moderate, days were long, and construction weather was ideal. He had approximately 10 weeks before snow would make building difficult. Most trappers would have spent this time establishing trap lines, scouting for beaver sign, and preparing for the fall trapping season. Lars spent it preparing to build. He returned to the valley where Anders had died. The grave cairn remained intact. The cabin they had shared still stood, though it looked even more inadequate to Lars now. He would not use it again. He would build something new, something that would not fail when conditions became severe. Other trappers were scattered through the region, returning from their summer travels and preparing for the season ahead. Magnus Olofsson had a camp 12 miles north. Gustav Andersson worked territory 15 miles east. These men and others heard that Lars had returned and came to see him, curious about his plans for the season. They found Lars surveying a hillside location half a mile from his old cabin. He had already begun clearing the site, removing brush and small trees from an area roughly 20 feet by 16 feet. The location puzzled the visitors. Building away from water sources meant hauling water daily. The hillside placement seemed to offer no advantages over flat ground near the creek. Magnus asked why Lars was building in such an impractical location. Lars explained his reasoning. The hillside allowed for earth berming, building partially into the ground to use soil as insulation. The elevation provided drainage and sight lines. The distance from water was inconvenient, but manageable, and the trade-off for better protection was worthwhile. The other trappers noticed Lars's supplies stacked near the site. Bundles of empty burlap sacks drew particular attention. Magnus picked up one of the bags and examined it. "You planning to ship furs? Why buy sacks before you have pelts?" Lars explained he would fill the bags with soil and use them to build his cabin walls. The explanation was met with confused silence. Gustav asked why anyone would build with sandbags when logs were readily available. Lars tried to describe thermal mass, explaining how earth-filled bags would hold temperature better than wood, would not rot or burn, and would create walls thick enough to provide genuine insulation. His explanation sounded strange even to his own ears. The concepts made sense to him after watching construction in St. Louis, but translating them into words that conveyed their value was difficult. Magnus laughed and called it building a fort to fight the winter. Other trappers joined the laughter. The image of Lars filling bags one shovel at a time, then stacking them to build a cabin, seemed absurd when logs could be notched and raised in days. Someone suggested Lars had spent too much time in the city and forgotten how frontier construction worked. Lars did not argue. He thanked them for visiting and returned to his site survey. The trappers left, discussing Lars's strange plans with a mixture of amusement and concern. Word spread through the scattered trapping community that Halverson was building something unusual, something that involved sandbags and military-style construction. The story grew with each retelling, and the mockery grew with it. Lars had chosen the hillside with specific requirements in mind. The slope faced southeast, maximizing sun exposure during winter months when sunlight was precious and brief. The angle of the hill was gentle enough to allow construction, but steep enough to provide natural drainage. Water would flow away from the structure rather than pooling against walls or seeping underneath. The soil composition mattered. Lars dug test holes at various points on the hillside. He needed ground that was stable enough to support the structure, but workable enough to allow excavation. Rocky soil would make digging impossible. Pure clay would shift and crack. Sandy loam would drain well, but might not provide adequate bearing strength. The site he selected had soil that mixed clay, sand, and organic material in proportions that satisfied his requirements. The ground would support the weight of earth-filled bags without settling excessively. It would drain adequately during rain and snowmelt. It could be excavated with hand tools, though the work would be difficult. He began by cutting into the hillside, creating a flat platform where the back wall of his structure would sit. This was earth berming, using the hill itself as part of the structure. The excavation was backbreaking work. Lars used a pickaxe to break up compacted soil, then shoveled the loosened earth into a pile he would later use for filling bags. Each day he removed approximately 2 cubic yards of soil. The work was slow, methodical, and physically exhausting. Other trappers occasionally rode past and watched him dig. The comments were consistent. Magnus stopped one afternoon and asked why Lars was digging his own grave. Someone else suggested he was preparing a root cellar and had confused it with a cabin. The jokes were good-natured but revealed genuine puzzlement. No one understood why excavation was necessary when surface construction was faster and easier. Lars completed the excavation in 2 weeks. The result was a flat platform cut into the hillside with a vertical earth wall at the back. The platform measured 20 feet wide by 16 feet deep. The back wall of earth rose 6 feet above the platform level. This wall would become the rear of his structure, insulated by tons of hillside soil. He staked out the perimeter of his building. The front wall would be entirely above ground. The 2 side walls would transition from earth bermed at the back to fully exposed at the front. The design meant the structure would be partially underground, using the earth itself as insulation on 3 sides while allowing the front wall to include a door and window for access and light. The sight lines from the platform were excellent. Lars could see down the valley in 3 directions. Anyone approaching would be visible long before they reached the structure. This visibility had defensive value, but more importantly, it provided warning of weather changes. Storms moving through the valley would be visible in time to secure the cabin and prepare. He began filling sandbags in late August. The process was simple but time-consuming. Each bag required approximately 40 pounds of soil. Lars shoveled soil into bags, tamped it down to eliminate air pockets, then tied the bags closed with twine. Each filled bag became a building block, weighing as much as a small log, but far more uniform in shape and density. The work of filling bags developed into a rhythm that consumed Lars's days. He rose at dawn and worked until dark, breaking only for brief meals. Each bag needed to be filled to consistent density. Too loose, and the bag would compress excessively when stacked, creating settling problems. Too tight, and the bag would be difficult to work with and might tear. Lars developed a technique of filling each bag approximately 3/4 full, then folding the top and tamping the entire bag to achieve uniform density before tying it closed. The soil he had excavated from the platform provided the first material. As that supply diminished, Lars dug additional soil from areas adjacent to his building site. He rejected rocky soil that would not compact properly. He avoided areas with high clay content that would become mud when wet. He sought sandy loam that would pack firmly and drain adequately. Each bag took approximately 5 minutes to fill, tamp, and tie. Working 10 hours per day, Lars could complete roughly 100 bags daily. He needed approximately 600 bags to build walls to his planned height and thickness. Simple arithmetic meant 6 days of filling bags. Reality proved slower. Physical fatigue reduced efficiency. Interruptions for other tasks consumed time. Lars actually spent 9 full days filling bags before he had accumulated enough to begin stacking. The bags lay in neat rows near his building site, a pile of brown burlap sacks that looked nothing like building materials. Magnus rode past one afternoon and stopped to examine the accumulation. He picked up one bag, surprised by its weight. "You're building a cabin out of these?" Magnus's tone was skeptical. "How do you stack sand? It will just shift and collapse." Lars explained that the bags themselves provided structure. The soil inside was compacted and would not shift. When stacked with proper overlap, the bags would create walls as stable as stone. Magnus remained unconvinced. He dropped the bag back onto the pile and shook his head. "Waste of time. You could have built a proper cabin in the time you've spent filling sacks." After Magnus left, Lars acknowledged the truth in the observation. A traditional log cabin required 3 to 5 days of construction with 2 men working. Lars had already spent 3 weeks on excavation and bag preparation without laying a single course. The time investment was massive compared to conventional construction. But time was not Lars's concern. Effectiveness was. A log cabin built in 4 days might last 4 years and fail during crisis. What Lars was building would last decades and protect him through conditions that would destroy standard construction. He began stacking bags in early September. The technique was similar to laying bricks, but with important differences. Each bag was placed with its long axis, perpendicular to the wall direction. The bags overlapped by roughly half their length, creating a running bond pattern, where no vertical joint aligned with the joint below it. This overlap distributed weight and created structural integrity. The first course went directly on the excavated platform. Lars placed bags carefully, ensuring they were level and properly aligned. The second course overlapped the first, and the pattern continued upward. The earth bag walls rose slowly. Each course required careful placement and alignment. Lars checked level constantly, correcting any deviation before it could propagate upward. The bags compressed slightly under the weight of courses above them, but the compression was predictable and consistent. After 3 courses, the bags had compressed to stable density and subsequent settling was minimal. The walls were thick, Lars built them 3 bags deep, creating walls approximately 30 inches thick. This thickness was extraordinary by frontier standards. Most log cabin walls were 6 to 8 inches thick, just the diameter of the logs. Lars's walls contained 3 times the material and created 3 times the insulation value. The thickness also provided structural strength. These walls could support enormous roof loads without risk of collapse. The back wall, built against the excavated hillside, required special treatment. Lars placed bags directly against the earth face, then packed soil between the bags and the hillside. This eliminated any air gap that could allow water infiltration or reduce insulation value. The result was a seamless transition from hillside earth to structural wall. Heat loss through this wall would be negligible because the thermal mass of the hillside itself backed the structure. The side walls transitioned from earth bermed at the rear to freestanding at the front. This created a tapered effect where the structure emerged gradually from the hillside. The transition required careful bag placement to maintain structural integrity while accommodating the changing wall configuration. The front wall was entirely freestanding and would contain the door and window. Lars built this wall with extra attention to alignment and compression. It would bear loads from the roof while also supporting door and window frames. He left appropriate gaps as he built, creating openings sized for the door and window he had planned. Other trappers stopped by occasionally to observe progress. The comments ranged from curious to mocking. Gustav Andersson examined the walls with genuine interest, running his hands over the stacked bags and noting their stability. "It's solid," he admitted, "but it looks like a military dugout, not a cabin." Magnus was less diplomatic. "You've built yourself a bunker to fight a war with winter. What's next, gun ports and defensive positions?" The joke spread. Other trappers began calling the structure Halverson's Fort or the War Bunker. Lars ignored the names. The structure's appearance was irrelevant. Its function was what mattered. By mid-September, the walls reached their planned height of 7 feet. The structure looked nothing like a traditional cabin. The thick earth bag walls, the earth-bermed design, the semi-subterranean positioning, all created an appearance that was foreign to frontier construction norms. It looked defensive, military, designed for siege rather than shelter. But the walls were solid beyond anything conventional construction could achieve. Lars pushed against them with full force. They did not flex or shift. He struck them with his axe handle. The impact absorbed into the dense mass without creating damage. These walls would not fail under snow load, wind pressure, or animal attack. They would not rot, burn, or deteriorate with age. They would protect him through conditions that would destroy lesser structures, and that protection was worth every strange look and mocking comment he endured during construction. The door opening measured 36 inches wide by 72 inches tall. Lars had left this gap in the front wall, reinforcing the sides with additional bag courses to support the load that would transfer around the opening. Now he needed to build a door worthy of the walls that surrounded it. He began with the frame. Most frontier doors hung on simple wooden frames attached to the wall structure with nails or pegs. These frames were adequate for lightweight doors, but created weakness. Lars built his frame differently. He used timber 8 inches square, far heavier than necessary for a simple door frame. He mortised the frame pieces together at corners, creating interlocking joints that made the frame a single, rigid unit. He positioned the frame in the door opening and secured it by building additional bag courses around it. The earth bag surrounded the frame on 3 sides, embedding it into the wall structure. The frame was not attached to the wall. It was part of the wall. Removing the frame would require tearing apart the earth bag courses that enclosed it. The door itself took 2 weeks to construct. Lars started with planks hewn from straight-grained pine. Each plank was 3 inches thick, far heavier than standard door construction. He shaped each plank with careful attention to edges, creating tongue and groove joints that would interlock. When assembled, the planks would form a single piece with no gaps or weak points. He cut tongues on one edge of each plank and grooves on the opposite edge. The work was tedious and required precision. Each joint needed to fit tightly without gaps, but also needed to slide together during assembly. Lars worked with a hand plane and chisels, testing each joint multiple times until it met his standards. Assembly took an entire day. He laid the planks on a flat surface and worked them together, tongue into groove, until all planks were joined. The result was a door blank measuring 34 inches wide and 70 inches tall. The assembled door was a single integrated piece that would not come apart under stress. Reinforcement came next. Lars had brought metal brackets from St. Louis, heavy iron pieces designed for industrial applications. He positioned these brackets diagonally across the interior face of the door, creating an X pattern. Each bracket was bolted through the door using the square-cut nails he had transported from St. Louis. The nails penetrated completely through the 3-inch planks and through the brackets. On the exterior face, Lars clinched the nail ends over, bending them back into the wood. The result was a connection that could not be pulled apart. The brackets would prevent warping and add rigidity to the already substantial door. The hinges required special installation. Lars had purchased massive iron hinges in St. Louis, each weighing 15 pounds. These were not decorative hardware. They were functional engineering designed to support heavy loads. He mortised pockets into both the door edge and the door frame, creating recesses where the hinges would sit flush. He positioned the hinges in these mortises and bolted them through using iron pins that penetrated 4 inches into solid wood. The installation meant the hinges were embedded into both door and frame. They could not be torn free without destroying the wood around them. The roof presented Lars's greatest engineering challenge. The structure would support not only its own weight, but also 18 inches of earth and potentially several feet of accumulated snow. The total load could exceed 10 tons. Standard frontier roof construction, simple poles laid across walls, would collapse immediately under such weight. Lars needed a design that would support extraordinary loads while remaining buildable by one man with hand tools. He began by selecting ridge beams. These primary structural members would span the 16-foot depth of the cabin and carry the roof load. Lars chose straight pine logs 12 inches in diameter, rejecting any timber with knots, twists, or irregularities. Each beam needed to be as uniform and strong as possible. He cut 8 beams and shaped them with his draw knife, creating flat surfaces on top and bottom while leaving the sides round for strength. The beams would rest on the earth bag walls. Lars created bearing surfaces by placing flat stones on top of the wall courses where beams would sit. These stones distributed beam weight across multiple bags rather than concentrating load on individual points. He positioned beams 18 inches apart, much closer spacing than standard construction. The close spacing meant each beam carried less individual load, and if one beam failed, adjacent beams could support the distribution. Cross members came next. Lars split logs into planks roughly 2 inches thick and 8 inches wide. He shaped these planks flat on one side and left them rounded on the other. The flat side would face down, creating an even surface. The rounded side would face up into the earth covering. He notched each plank to sit securely on the ridge beams and pegged them in place with wooden pins he had whittled during evening hours. The planks overlapped like roof shingles, each course covering the gaps in the course below. This overlapping created a surface where no continuous gap existed. Water finding its way through one layer would be blocked by the layer beneath. Lars used over 200 planks, creating a roof deck that was essentially a solid wooden platform. Over the planks, he laid birch bark. He had collected bark in large sheets during summer and stored it flat to prevent curling. The bark was naturally waterproof and flexible. Lars laid it in overlapping courses, each sheet covering the edges of sheets below it. The bark created a moisture barrier between the wooden deck and the earth that would cover it. The bark layer received special treatment. Lars had developed a mixture using clay, sand, and pine resin he had boiled down from sap. This mixture, applied while warm, was spreadable like thick paint. He covered the entire bark surface with this compound, creating a layer roughly half an inch thick. The mixture sealed every potential gap and added waterproofing beyond what bark alone provided. Gustav stopped by during roof construction and watched Lars applying the clay mixture. "That's a lot of work for a roof that will be buried under dirt," Gustav observed. Lars explained that the waterproofing was essential. Any moisture penetrating to the wooden deck would cause rot. The structure was designed to last decades, and that required preventing water infiltration completely. The earth covering transformed the structure from unusual cabin to something that barely resembled human habitation. Lars began by hauling soil onto the completed roof deck. Each shovelful was carried up a ramp he had built against the front wall. The work was exhausting. He estimated the roof would require approximately 15 cubic yards of soil to achieve his target depth of 18 inches across the entire surface. He worked systematically, spreading soil evenly as he hauled it. The goal was uniform depth across the entire roof. Uneven loading could create stress points or allow water pooling. Lars used a measuring stick constantly, checking depth and making adjustments. The close-spaced ridge beams supported the accumulating weight without flexing. The structure was handling the load exactly as he had calculated. The soil he used was the same sandy loam he had used for filling earth bags. It would compact adequately under its own weight and under rain, but it would also drain rather than becoming waterlogged. Clay soil would have been problematic, retaining water and adding weight during wet periods. Pure sand would have drained too quickly and provided inadequate growing medium for the final layer. After 10 days of hauling soil, Lars had achieved 18 inches of earth coverage across the entire roof. The weight was enormous, but the structure showed no signs of stress. The earth bag walls compressed slightly under the increased load, but the compression was uniform and minimal. The building was solid. The final layer was sod. Lars cut sections of prairie grass with intact root systems, creating rectangles roughly 12 inches by 18 inches. He laid these grass side up across the entire soil surface, fitting them together like puzzle pieces. The roots would grow into the soil beneath, creating a living roof that would hold the earth layer in place and prevent erosion. The sod layer had multiple functions beyond erosion control. Living grass would absorb some water during rain, reducing runoff. The root mat would create additional insulation value, and grass would make the structure nearly invisible from a distance, blending with the surrounding hillside. The camouflage was unintentional but welcome. A structure that did not attract attention was a structure that would not attract problems. With the earth blanket complete, the structure's appearance changed dramatically. What had been an unusual earth bag building was now a grass-covered mound emerging from the hillside. Only the front wall with its door and window opening indicated human construction. From any other angle, the structure looked like a natural feature of the landscape. Magnus rode past the day Lars finished the sod layer. He sat his horse for several minutes, studying the structure. Finally, he called to Lars. "I've seen military earthworks that looked less defensive than this. You expecting to fight a siege?" Lars responded that he was expecting to survive winter. Magnus shook his head. "That's not a cabin, that's a fortification." He rode away without waiting for a response. The name stuck. Other trappers began referring to it exclusively as Halverson's Bunker, or simply the bunker. Lars accepted the name. What others called it mattered less than what it would do when winter arrived. Lars installed 2 chimneys where most cabins had 1 or none. The decision was deliberate and based on principles of redundancy and efficiency. A single heating source created a single point of failure. If one chimney became blocked by snow or ice, if one stove malfunctioned, if any problem occurred with a single heating system, the occupant was left without heat during conditions when heat meant survival. He positioned the chimneys on opposite sides of the roof, each offset from center by approximately 4 feet. This placement meant heat from two stoves would warm different zones of the interior space. The thermal mass of the earth bag walls and earth-covered roof would absorb heat from both sources and radiate it slowly, creating stable temperature throughout the structure. The chimneys themselves were metal, purchased in St. Louis specifically for this application. Each was 6-inch diameter stovepipe designed for wood-burning stoves. Metal chimneys were expensive compared to mud and stick chimneys that most trappers built, but metal would not deteriorate, would not catch fire, and would draft consistently in any weather. Lars was spending money on every component of this structure, investing profits from multiple trapping seasons into construction that would protect him for decades. He cut holes through the roof deck for each chimney, making the openings slightly larger than the pipe diameter. He installed the chimneys plumb and sealed around them with his clay mixture, creating weather-tight penetrations. The chimneys extended 4 feet above the earth-covered roof surface, high enough to create adequate draft and high enough to remain clear of all but the deepest snow accumulation. Inside the structure, Lars positioned 2 small stoves beneath the chimneys. The stoves were cast iron, each weighing approximately 80 pounds. He had hauled them into the mountains on pack horses, another expensive purchase that conventional trappers would consider unnecessary. Most frontier shelters used simple fire pits or crude mud fireplaces. Proper stoves were luxuries, but proper stoves were also efficient. They burned less wood to produce more heat, and they contained fire safely. Magnus visited the day Lars installed the second stove. He stood in the doorway examining the interior. "One chimney's not good enough for your palace?" The sarcasm was obvious. Lars explained his reasoning about redundancy and distributed heating. Magnus laughed. "You're preparing for winter like you're preparing for war. 2 stoves, walls thick enough to stop cannonballs, enough earth on the roof to bury a man. What are you afraid of?" Lars considered the question seriously. "I'm not afraid of anything. I'm preparing for everything." Magnus's expression shifted from mockery to something approaching respect. "That's a hell of a difference between the two, isn't it?" He looked around the interior, again seeing it differently. "How much wood will you need to heat this through winter?" Lars had calculated it carefully. The thermal mass and insulation meant the structure would hold temperature with minimal heating. Maybe a cord per month, possibly less. Magnus whistled softly. "My cabin uses that much in 2 weeks during hard cold." He left without additional comment, but Lars noticed Magnus's tone had changed. The mockery had diminished, replaced by curiosity. The structure was complete in late September 1883. 4 months of continuous work had transformed a hillside into shelter unlike anything else in the northern frontier. Lars stood back and assessed what he had built. The structure was functional, solid, and exactly what he had envisioned. From the front, the cabin presented a single earth bag wall with a heavy door and 1 small window positioned high on the wall. The window was 16 inches square, large enough to provide light and ventilation, but small enough to minimize heat loss. Lars had built a thick wooden shutter that could be secured from inside, and he had covered the opening with oiled canvas treated with his waterproofing mixture. From any other angle, the structure disappeared into the hillside. The grass-covered earth roof blended with surrounding terrain. The earth-bermed sides merged with the slope. Only someone looking directly at the front would recognize human construction. The camouflage was so effective that Gustav, visiting one afternoon, rode past the structure twice before locating it. The interior was compact but efficiently designed. The space measured 20 feet wide by 16 feet deep, creating 320 square feet of living area. The ceiling height was 7 feet at the front, tapering slightly toward the earth-bermed rear. 2 stoves provided heating. Shelves built into the earth bag walls held supplies. A sleeping platform raised 18 inches off the floor provided storage beneath and kept Lars off the cold earth. The floor was compacted earth, treated with Lars's clay mixture and covered with split logs laid flat. The wood floor provided insulation from ground cold and created a level surface. Lars had considered stone flooring but rejected it. Stone would be colder, harder to keep clean, and more difficult to install. He moved his possessions into the structure over several days. His tools, trapping equipment, food supplies, ammunition, and personal items filled the shelves and storage spaces. Everything had its place. The organization was military in its precision, but that precision served purpose. In winter darkness, Lars would need to locate items without light. Organization meant efficiency and safety. Other trappers came to see the finished structure. The reactions varied. Gustav examined it with professional interest, noting the construction details and asking questions about techniques. Magnus remained skeptical, but less openly mocking. Several other trappers viewed it as confirmation that Lars had become eccentric, building something far beyond necessary for simple survival. The common assessment was that Lars had wasted 4 months of prime trapping season building shelter that was excessive for the need. A standard cabin provided adequate protection and could be built in days. Lars had invested over 100 days into construction that solved problems no one else considered serious. The name bunker was universal now. No one called it a cabin. The structure was Halverson's bunker, and Lars was the trapper who built a fort to fight winter. The mockery was good-natured but persistent. Lars had become a local character, the man whose paranoia had driven him to military-grade construction for civilian purposes. Lars accepted the characterization without argument. He knew what the structure would do. The trappers who mocked him would understand when conditions tested their shelters and his. Until then, their opinions were irrelevant. He had built what he needed. The coming winter would prove whether his investment had been justified. Winter came early in 1883. Snow fell in mid-October, and temperatures dropped below freezing to stay there until spring. Lars had his trap lines established and his bunker fully stocked with firewood and supplies. The first weeks of winter were routine. Cold, but manageable. Lars tended his traps, processed furs, and tested his shelter under gradually worsening conditions. The earth bag walls performed exactly as he had calculated. Interior temperature remained stable regardless of exterior conditions. When outside air dropped to 0 degrees, the inside stayed near 50 degrees with a single small fire burning. The thermal mass absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. Lars could let the fire die overnight and wake to interior temperatures that were still comfortable. The contrast with standard log cabins became obvious. Magnus visited one afternoon in late November, and Lars noticed ice crystals in Magnus's beard from the short ride between cabins. Magnus stamped snow off his boots and stepped inside. His eyes widened at the temperature difference. "It's warm in here," he said with surprise. Lars had only one stove burning with a modest fire. "The walls hold heat," Lars explained. "I don't need to keep fire roaring constantly." Magnus examined the earth bag walls more carefully now, seeing them as functional rather than eccentric. "How much wood are you burning?" Lars estimated he was using less than half what he had used in previous winters. The efficiency came from insulation and thermal mass working together. Heat did not escape quickly, so less fuel was needed to maintain comfort. The roof proved its design during heavy snow in early December. 18 inches of wet snow fell over 3 days. Lars watched through his small window as accumulation built on surrounding trees and landscape. On his earth-covered roof, the snow added to existing depth but created no structural stress. The roof did not sag or creak. The close-spaced ridge beams distributed load exactly as planned. He went outside after the storm to check for damage. Other cabins in the area showed strain. Magnus's cabin had a visible sag in the roof center. Gustav's cabin had developed a crack in one wall where settling under snow load had stressed the structure. Lars's bunker showed no effects. The structure was handling loads that stressed conventional construction. The two-chimney system proved valuable in unexpected ways. One chimney developed ice buildup during extreme cold in January, partially blocking draft. Lars simply used the second stove while the first chimney cleared. In a single chimney cabin, the blockage would have created a crisis, filling the interior with smoke and forcing the occupant to go outside in dangerous conditions to clear the obstruction. Word spread through the trapping community that Halverson's bunker was performing well. The mockery decreased. Trappers dealing with their own shelter problems began asking questions about Lars's construction methods. How thick were the walls? How did he waterproof the roof? What mixture did he use for sealing? The questions were tentative, asked almost reluctantly, as if seeking advice somehow validated Lars's excessive preparation. By late winter, the assessment had shifted. The bunker was still considered unusual and over-engineered, but it was no longer viewed as purely eccentric. It was effective, undeniably so, and that effectiveness was difficult to dismiss. November 1884 began with temperatures that veteran trappers recognized as ominous. By mid-month, the thermometer showed readings normally seen in January. By late November, conditions had deteriorated to levels that old-timers described as unprecedented. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero and stayed there. Snow fell heavily and continuously. Wind howled across the Montana Territory with sustained speeds that made travel dangerous and exposed skin deadly. Lars had prepared adequately. His firewood supply was stacked and covered. His food stores would last until spring. His bunker was sealed and ready. He settled into winter routine, venturing outside only when necessary to check trap lines or gather firewood from his covered stack. The bunker's efficiency became even more apparent under extreme conditions. He burned one stove most of the time, using the second only during the coldest periods. Interior temperature remained stable between 48 and 55 degrees. Outside, conditions worsened beyond anything Lars had experienced. By early December, the temperature had dropped to 45 below zero. At this extreme, exposed skin froze in minutes. Breathing outdoor air was painful. Metal became dangerous to touch with bare hands. Travel between shelters required full protective clothing and careful planning. Other trappers were struggling. Magnus's cabin, adequate in normal winters, was bleeding heat continuously. He burned wood constantly, consuming his supply at rates that would exhaust it long before spring. The gaps between his logs had become conduits for heat loss. Ice formed on interior walls where warm air met freezing surfaces. Magnus spent his days feeding fire and his nights shivering despite the flames. Gustav's situation was worse. His cabin roof had developed a concerning sag under snow load. He had reinforced it from inside using poles, but the temporary supports were clearly inadequate for prolonged stress. Gustav was rationing firewood, knowing his supply was insufficient. He was burning furniture and non-essential items to supplement his woodpile. The storm that began on December 15th changed everything. Snow fell for 6 consecutive days. Wind created drifts that buried structures and made travel impossible. Temperatures remained below 40 degrees. Negative. The combination of extreme cold, heavy snow, and sustained wind created conditions that tested every structure and every survival decision. Lars watched the storm through his small window. Snow accumulated on his roof, adding to the existing depth. By the third day, he estimated 4 feet of new snow on top of his earth covering. The total load on his roof was extraordinary, but the structure showed no stress. Inside, the bunker was comfortable. The earth insulation and the snow accumulation actually improved insulation value. Lars burned less wood during the blizzard than he had burned before it. On the 9th day of continuous extreme conditions, Magnus appeared at Lars's door. The story of that arrival, of what Magnus found inside the bunker versus what he had left behind in his failing cabin, would mark the moment when Halverson's bunker transformed from local oddity to recognized innovation. Magnus stayed in the bunker for 3 days while the blizzard continued. His own cabin had become uninhabitable. The roof was sagging dangerously under snow weight. His firewood supply was nearly exhausted despite burning continuously. Ice had formed on interior walls thick enough to reduce living space. Magnus had made the decision to abandon his shelter before it collapsed or before he froze to death inside it. Lars shared his food and warmth without hesitation. The bunker easily accommodated 2 men. The thermal mass maintained comfortable temperature even with both occupants and only one stove burning. Magnus was quiet for the first day, recovering from exposure and exhaustion. On the second day, he began asking questions about construction methods, about thermal mass principles, about why the bunker worked when conventional cabins failed. The news that reached them when the storm cleared was grim. Gustav Andersson had lost 3 fingers on his left hand to frostbite. His cabin roof had partially collapsed under snow weight, forcing him to shelter in the remaining covered section while burning everything combustible to maintain minimal heat. He had survived but was permanently injured and had lost most of his supplies. A trapper named William Holt had frozen to death in his cabin 12 miles south. His firewood had run out during the storm. He had burned his furniture, his floorboards, and finally his door, trying to stay warm. When neighbors reached his cabin after the storm, they found him frozen in his sleeping robes. The fire had gone out, and the temperature inside the cabin had matched the temperature outside. Death had come slowly. 2 other trappers, the Morrison brothers, had abandoned their cabin and attempted to reach a trading post 40 miles east. They were found frozen along the trail, having made it less than 10 miles before succumbing to exposure. Their cabin, later examined, had been structurally sound but thermally inadequate. They had run out of firewood and made the fatal decision to travel in extreme conditions, rather than wait for help. The mortality rate shocked the surviving trapping community. 5 men had died within a 50-mile radius during 1 month of extreme weather. Others, like Gustav, had survived but suffered permanent injury. The cabins that had seemed adequate in normal winters had failed catastrophically under stress. Magnus moved his remaining supplies into Lars's bunker. His cabin was structurally compromised, and he lacked resources to repair it before spring. Lars agreed to the arrangement. The bunker had space, and the partnership would allow them to share work during the remaining winter months. Gustav visited in late January, after his hand had healed enough to travel. He examined the bunker with the focus of a man who had nearly died due to inadequate shelter. He asked detailed questions about earthbag construction, about roof engineering, about the clay mixture Lars had used for waterproofing. He took notes, drawing sketches of construction details. "I'm building one of these come spring," Gustav said. "I'm not spending another winter in a cabin that tries to kill me." Magnus nodded agreement. 2 of us building together, we can have it done before trapping season starts. The winter of 1884 finally broke in late March. Temperatures rose above freezing, snow began melting, and the Montana Territory emerged from months of conditions that had killed men and destroyed conventional shelters. Lars and Magnus had survived comfortably, their partnership in the bunker demonstrating that adequate shelter transformed winter from deadly threat to manageable inconvenience. The bunker had performed beyond even Lars's calculations. Total firewood consumption for the entire winter had been less than 3 cords. A conventional cabin would have required 10 cords or more. The earthbag walls had maintained structural integrity under massive snow loads. The earth-covered roof had supported over 6 feet of accumulated snow without flexing. The 2-chimney system had provided redundancy that prevented crisis when one chimney temporarily blocked. Gustav returned in April with detailed plans for his own earthbag structure. He had spent winter sketching designs, calculating materials, planning construction that incorporated lessons from Lars's bunker with modifications suited to his location and needs. Magnus committed to helping with construction, contributing labor in exchange for learning techniques he would use for his own rebuild. The construction techniques spread rapidly through the surviving trapping community. By summer of 1885, 4 earth-bag structures were under construction within 30 miles of Lars's original bunker. Each builder adapted the basic principles to their specific situation, but all incorporated thermal mass walls, earth-covered roofs, and over-engineered construction that prioritized survival over speed. The name evolved. Halverson's bunker became simply a Halverson cabin, or bunker-style construction. The term spread beyond the immediate area. Traders carried stories of the innovative shelter design to distant posts. New trappers arriving in the territory heard about construction methods that had saved lives during the winter of '84. Lars never promoted his techniques or claimed credit for innovation. He shared information freely with anyone who asked. He helped Gustav and Magnus with their constructions, explaining principles and demonstrating methods. The spread of earth-bag building was organic, driven by men who recognized that adequate shelter was not luxury, but necessity. Over the following decade, dozens of earth-bag structures were built across the northern frontier. The specific designs varied, but the core principles remained consistent. Thermal mass walls using earth-filled bags or similar materials, earth-bermed positioning when terrain allowed, substantial roof engineering to support earth covering and snow loads, multiple heating, sources for redundancy, overbuilt doors, and minimal windows to reduce heat loss. The mortality rate among trappers in the region decreased measurably. Fewer men froze in inadequate shelters. Fewer structures collapsed under winter loads. The buildings that incorporated thermal mass engineering survived conditions that destroyed conventional construction. Lars continued trapping until 1892, when declining fur prices made the profession unprofitable. He sold his territory and moved to a small ranch in the Bitterroot Valley. His bunker remained, occupied by subsequent trappers who recognized its value. The structure stood for over 40 years, finally abandoned in the 1920s when the area became part of a national forest. The legacy was not monuments or recognition, but survival. Men lived through winters that would have killed them in lesser shelters. The innovation was not celebrated because it was quiet, practical, born from tragedy rather than ambition. Lars had built something that worked, shared it freely, and moved on. That was enough.